IUP with us this morning. Our conversation brought to you by Marcus and Mack, a law firm representing injured people. Tim, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you with us here today. You are the chair of IUP's Educational and School Psychology Department, and I was spurred to ask you to come on and visit with us because of an event that you and Joe Kowaleski, Professor Emeritus, gave over in the month of May about education and some of the issues that kids who have been out of a classroom since March are going to be dealing with, hopefully when they get back to class next month, but whenever it is that they get back to class, there are going to be some real academic challenges, and I'd like to get into that with you here this morning. What are some of those challenges that kids are going to be facing?
Sure, absolutely. What we anticipate is, among many things, is that students coming into the fall will likely be at a different point of their academic development than they would have in any other previous year. And most schools these days, particularly at the elementary and middle schools, tend to do a lot of academic screening very early on in the academic year to kind of gauge where students are in terms of their reading, writing, and mathematics skill development. And what we anticipate is that given the massive disruptions of education in the spring of 2020, those same kind of practices in terms of screening for academic skills at the beginning of the new school year are likely to be ineffective and inefficient at identifying student needs. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is that I think schools are really going to have to think differently about how they screen for academic challenges because, let's be honest, we're going to have massive numbers and proportions of students who basically missed out on at least a quarter of their education, or at least at best got some semblance of quality education. And this is not to disparage the efforts of schools and teachers in the spring. It's just the reality was that there was a massive disruption.
One of the things that struck me about the article that was posted about your presentation back in May, well, actually a couple of things. Number one, there is a disparity between those who were able to learn only using packets that were picked up at the school and those who were online, Those who were able to get online. That's one thing. And the other thing is, you made a particular point that teachers in a classroom setting can pick up on some visual cues that give them an idea that this student over here might be struggling with the concept as opposed to this student over here who gets it. And that becomes a real particular issue too, doesn't it?
Absolutely, especially when we think of, the schools missed out on about approximately 25% of face-to-face instruction last academic year. So that's 25% of knowledge and information that teachers would otherwise have had that they likely lost, or at least had very limited opportunities to gather information because they were doing things virtually. And so as a consequence, we lose out on our understanding of student development, not only just in terms of their academic skills, but of course their social and emotional development and other things and those are all the intangible things that teachers would have noticed in the spring. And so that, coming into the fall, they're going to have a hard time dealing with that. Plus, we need to remember that staff are equally going to be challenged because they're dealing with their own, personal and professional difficulties with the pandemic at home and at work, and then, of course, trying to meet the needs of students.
I would suspect that a teacher would tell you how much better they were at the end of this last academic year at presenting something online than they were at the beginning, and that if they have to continue educating students in that way, they're much better prepared. Still, they'd love to have everybody back in the classroom in front of them so they could have that teacher-student interaction.
Absolutely. If you think about what happened in the spring, most public schools had to pivot within a weekend or maybe at best a week or two from completely face-to-face to virtual educational delivery. And let's be honest, most teachers were not necessarily trained to deliver instruction online. And so they had to build up their skills, and districts had to build up their capacity to deliver online learning in a relatively short period of time. The good news is that I am well aware of many schools, particularly in our area, but just statewide and nationally, that have spent this summer beefing up the skills and the technologies that teachers will have at their disposal if we have to continue with virtual learning. So we're going to be in a much better position moving forward, of course. And I commend schools and teachers who had to pivot literally in a weekend back in the spring for doing the job that they did, which was an outstanding job given the circumstances.
And one of the things you pointed out as well is that now, as challenging as it is, there are real opportunities here for educators too, aren't there?
Absolutely, absolutely. Of course, there are many technologies that are available to educators to deliver online instruction or virtual learning opportunities. And again, I am well aware of the fact that local and regional and statewide school districts have really capitalized upon this summer to maximize those professional development opportunities for teachers, making sure that they have the technologies and the access for teachers to deliver that instruction, as well as finding out ways to make sure that students have the technologies they need in order to really maximize their opportunities for virtual learning. Because again, we got to figure out how to make sure that students have the technologies, whether it's a computer and or high-speed internet access, and making sure that they can actually receive the instruction in their homes if we have to go to that particular modality of instructional delivery.
All right, let me see if I can phrase this correctly or frame it correctly. I want you to give us some tips or some advice, first for parents, and I want to break it into two groups. Parents of students who are older and have been in school for a while, parents for students who have been or are just having their first year or two of experience in a school setting, the youngest kids. What should parents be doing now? What should they be thinking about as the fall approaches?
Very good question. It is my opinion that I think parents need to be very much in communication with their school administrators and their child's teachers to find out how we as parents, because I have three daughters, as my wife and I have three daughters as well who go to Indiana, and so to remain in close contact and communication with your child's teachers and to ask for simple, basic things that you can do to support your child's development at home. Whether that be, going back to your question, for the older kids, maybe it's much more just making sure that they're keeping up and on top of their assignments, logging in to see where they are in terms of the progression of the work that they're supposed to be completing. For the younger students, particularly at the primary grades, kindergarten 1, 2, and 3, for example, it would be helpful if parents have the ability, the time, and the resources, which I know is a big if for many, but even to just do simple things with your kids like read to them or read with them, ask them to read to you. It doesn't require a whole lot of expertise per se, just to have them practicing some of these basic reading, writing, and math skills at home, and reach out to teachers to try to get some suggestions as to how to do that. That one was for reading. You could have your younger child do some writing, creative writing, and you're not looking at or trying to, make it polished, publication-worthy kind of literature, but just have them practice some of these basic skills. Those are the simple things that parents can do. Communication with your teachers and administrators and trying to support them in their development. Again, differentiating between what is appropriate support at the high school level versus what would be more appropriate at the elementary grades.
I think it's kind of interesting as well that you point out that it's not just going to be the educators themselves, but the school psychologists, and this is one of your particular areas of expertise. School psychologists are going to have to be very, very involved and probably and certainly in different ways now under this virtual format than they have been in the past.
Absolutely. As you noted, I'm a trained school psychologist working in public schools for approximately 10 years before coming to IUP. And at a time when districts I know are strapped for resources, if there ever was a call for a critical review of bolstering our mental health services in schools, such as school psychologists, school counselors, and school social workers, those individuals are going to be even more critical as we return to school, whether it's in a traditional format or in a virtual format. And I know it's difficult for school boards and school administrators to look at hiring or bolstering those kinds of supports and resources at a time when budgets are incredibly tight. But it is going to be so critical because schools do more than just teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. We make sure that we educate the whole child, and our staff are going to need that kind of mental health support as well. And so it's critical that schools make sure they allocate resources for those additional supports to make sure that the whole school community is well equipped to deal with the fall.
I've talked with a lot of teachers over the years about the education gap that goes from May to September, basically. The kids getting back into school, they haven't been focused upon learning and education as much as they would have been in the course of a school year. And so there is that gap that has to be overcome every year, a review process. That gap's probably going to be much wider this year, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. In many circles, what you're referring to is commonly called the summer slide, where students typically regress maybe a few months of instructional gains that they had from the previous year. an administrator, a regional administrator that I was working with earlier this summer. I don't know if she necessarily coined the term, but it was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And she is describing what they're about to face in the fall is not the summer slide, but the COVID avalanche.
Oh.
And that is that students, again, if we think about it, especially our most needy students who had limited resources and ability to access virtual learning last spring, they not only are going to slide from the summer, but they didn't probably benefit a whole lot from the spring instruction because they couldn't access it. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, we're not talking about a summer slide. We're looking at, as a colleague of mine had referred to, the COVID avalanche. And that is frightening, but it is an opportunity for schools to step up. And I know that our educational system can certainly do that. I have great confidence and faith in our administrators, our school boards, and certainly our teachers and support personnel to make sure that we can bolster our students and help them achieve great success despite what's happened over the last number of months.
Hey, as a psychologist, you probably have a better insight onto this than anybody. I'm thinking of, particular students. Some students ended this year really struggling with the learning process as the way it was at the end of the year, knowing that they weren't getting what they really needed. And sometimes, and frankly, some students just, they give up caring about it. Now they have a new school year coming, and probably some of them are dreading the fact that the new school year is coming because they know already that they're starting behind their classmates. What can be done to help those students? So, because frankly, after a week or two, students sort of get that stress level up because they realize I'm way behind everybody else, and it's not going to get better unless I find something else that is going to help me. So what can those students be thinking about right now?
Absolutely, and certainly our hearts go out to any student who feels that way. And this is not atypical, however, of any other year, because we've always had students who have struggled. It's just I believe that it's likely to be far greater numbers as we come into the fall. And this would include students who struggle academically or students with disabilities or, any sort of marginalized student population. And so I guess the advice that I would have goes back to the earlier advice that I made for all students, and that would be close communication and contact with your school's teachers as well as administrators. And so I think that connection between teacher and student is even more so going to be critical as we move into the fall, particularly for students who struggle academically or socially or emotionally or behaviorally. They're going to need that extra support from the teachers. And so once again, that communication piece is going to be absolutely critical. And making sure that parents, again, are also included in that communication loop as well. So I don't necessarily think it's going to be anything different. I think it's just going to be a situation where we need to really focus our energies to provide a little bit extra, if not a lot, of extra support for students with disabilities or students who are marginalized or students who otherwise would not feel very positive about coming into a new school year.
Well, Dr. Tim Runge, it's been really good having you on with us. We have to do this again. We could go on for a long, long time talking about all these various educational issues. And I know folks are wondering because it's getting closer and closer. And you've been very, very beneficial for us here today. Thanks for being with us.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Dr. Tim Runge from IUP. Tim Runge from IUP. Tim